Hi, everyone, and welcome to this webinars animated by data scientists, where we have the privilege of having some fantastic guests talk us through some fantastic data science, analytics, and data engineering topics. Today, a great host with Marta Batlle, with whom I'll introduce in just a few seconds. But before we go right into the topic of today, a quick little reminder that this is hosted with Data Scientist, and we are a training institution specializing in everything analytics, data science, data engineering, and DevOps engineering. So if you're ever interested in our training course, please feel free to visit our website. In any case, I'm delighted to introduce Marta Batlle, data scientist at Roche, who will be talking through this webinar about data privacy for dummies. Welcome, Marta, to the stage.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for the introduction. Very excited to be here. I'm very cool introduction as well.
Yes, pleasure to meet you. And I think without any further ado, let's dive right in. I think you have a quick little presentation for us, and so we're happy to hear a bit more about everything you have to tell us.
Great, thank you. Thank you, and welcome everybody. As Theo said, I'm Marta. I'm a data scientist, and in my daily work, I focus mainly on two topics: on data privacy and data privacy technologies, and on responsible AI. So I thought it was a bit of my duty to spread a bit the word about data privacy because I feel it's a topic that many people are concerned about nowadays because we don't know what data is collected from ourselves, what's going on with this data. Um, we're also scared about all data and artificial intelligence topics. So I hope I can answer some of your questions. I hope I can remove some of your fears. And I hope that during this presentation you can learn a bit more about the basics of data privacy. And if you have some questions at the end, we will have some time for questions. So just wait until the end. Good. So as you well know, we live in a world where we are constantly clicking, tapping, and scrolling. And all of this leaves a digital breadcrumb, right? Every time you update your social status on social media, make an online purchase, or even when you use your smartphone, when you search on the web, and so on, you are actually sharing personal data. In fact, it's estimated that an average person generates over 2.5 quintillion bytes of data every single day. And I haven't measured that, but this sounds like a lot of data that we are generating every single day. And yes, we are constantly sharing our personal data on social media. When we post a photo, when we have a conversation on any social media platform, we share identity information, our location, etc. Also, when we use our online accounts like Netflix, for example, we are sharing our preferences and we are sharing our bank accounts. And when we buy online or use Amazon, buy on Amazon, for example, we also share preferences. We share purchasing history. We share what we bought last month and what we are going to buy today, right? Also with our apps, many of our apps save location data. They track our steps. They track some health data information. Our apps, the bank apps, store the bank transactions. They store spending patterns, so on and so on. And web browsing. There are cookies, and they kind of follow the websites that we are checking, and they follow the purchases that we make or our interests. So, yes, we are constantly, all the time, sharing personal data that can identify us, right? It identifies our preferences and basically our identities. And this personal data that we are constantly sharing is in fact being collected, stored, and protected, also protected by organizations. These organizations can use your data, yes, but only if there is consent. So basically, if they store it and they are processing it, it means that you must have given consent to them to do that. In the same way, these organizations can share your data with third parties, but again, only if you gave consent to do that. Or in really, really particular circumstances, for example, during the COVID pandemic, that also happened. But it's really, really rare. And all of these processes, so the fact that organizations store and use your data or can share your data, is always under specific data regulations, right? So, for example, in the European Union, we have the GDPR, and the US, the HIPAA, etc., etc. Understanding the basics of data privacy and consent is key to knowing what can happen with our information, right? It's important to break some myths about data privacy and be mindful when sharing personal information. The GDPR, or the General Data Protection Regulation, was implemented in 2018, and it basically acts as a digital shield. It safeguards individuals' privacy rights online. And even though GDPR, most of us have heard about GDPR, and it sounds kind of boring topic, right? It's actually very important for us because it empowers us with a lot of control over our personal information. And it ensures transparency about the data collection, what data has been collected from us, and how it is used. And so, thanks to the GDPR, users have the right to know what data is collected, why, and how it's used. And this allows us to have informed decisions about data privacy and our data. So, there are important elements that the GDPR offers us. And the first one is data protection by design and accountability, right? Data protection by design and accountability requires basically organizations to implement measures like pseudonymization, encryption, data minimization to basically ensure privacy and security throughout the data lifecycle. So the fact that now organizations are accountable for this data protection means that there will be very, very high fines for organizations that are not compliant with the GDPR, which makes organizations be very serious about data protection privacies. These fines can go up to 20 million euros, or 4% of the organization's global annual turnover, whichever is higher. So that's a huge fine. Under the GDPR, organizations are now required to obtain explicit and unambiguous consent from individuals before collecting their data and processing it. So that means that it should be more clear now, when our data is collected and how it will be processed. And also, very importantly, we can always withdraw our consent at any time. The GDPR also gives us right to access our data, to know what data has been collected from us, and know how it is used. And finally, something that's also very important is that now we have the right to be forgotten, which means that we can always ask our data to be deleted, which didn't happen before. So now we know how important it is for us to have such a regulation like the GDPR. I think it gives us a lot of control over our data, and most importantly, transparency. And it ensures that organizations take these data privacy topics seriously. Companies, in order to ensure that they are compliant with the data privacy policies, not only because of the fines, but also because they need to take data privacy seriously. They need to ensure that they are using our data safely to make sure that the individual's privacy is not at risk. um, Organizations might decide to use different technologies to actually implement these data protection and data privacy principles by design, adding additional layers of security and privacy to our data. So, picture this. You go to a party and you don't want anyone to recognize you. So, in the world of data, when we have a database with all our information, when we talk about anonymization, what we want to do is to basically strip away all the data that can identify us. So basically, we still have some information about someone, but there's no way that we can identify that person. In the same way that, if this kid went to a party, it would be more difficult to understand who is that kid, right? So anonymization is an important process because again, it allows organizations to add another layer of security and privacy into our data. And so, what is really anonymization? So anonymization is the process through which we remove or obfuscate personally identifiable information from the data. So in other words, the risk of identifying an individual in a data set will be substantially minimized. This allows the use of data for fostering innovation, for scientific development, and so on, while posing minimal risks to individuals' privacy. So let's dig into this process. Let's see how is really done in practice to really understand what we mean when we use anonymized data. So first, an organization or us, we collect all the data that we need for our scientific study. Next, we select all the identifying variables. So all that variables that can help us identify a specific person, like their name, their address, or their phone number. We need to differentiate between different variables. We have variables that are called direct identifiers, and these are the variables that directly identify an individual. Again, like their name, their ID, or their picture, actually. We also have quasi-identifiers, and these are variables or information that our friends could know about us, um, that could help them identify us. So, for example, that that person that smokes a lot, or that person that was born on the 25th of December, for example. A lot of different quasi-identifiers together can actually help a friend identify us. And finally, we have the rest of the variables or information which we call sensitive data, that are not identifiers of a person. So once we've identified the variables that could help someone identify us, we will use anonymization techniques or transformation techniques to remove this data that can identify us. We can use different techniques to remove data that can identify us. So the most obvious one, I guess, is just to suppress specific variables. So, for example, we will always suppress addresses because we are not. It's not information that gives us anything. We might also remove date of birth, for example. But as you can imagine, this actually removes a lot of important information. So, for example, if I remove the date of birth in a study of prediction of a particular disease, I will lose the information about the age of the person, which is really a predictor of disease onset or progression of disease. So there are other techniques that I can use to remove the part that identifies a person without losing this important information. So, for example, we have techniques like generalization, where instead of storing the age, specific age of that person, for example, 64, we can store an age bucket. So, this person is between 60 and 70. In this way, if we store people's data in this way, um, we are still, storing some important information for analysis without storing anything that could help us identify them. So it's not really personal data anymore. That's a key idea to remember. And finally, we can also add random noise. So for example, we can add random numbers to the age. So 64 plus 5. We have an individual now that it's 69. And so it's again not your personal data because it's not something that identifies you, but actually it still gives some information to the scientists that want to understand a specific disease, for example. So once we've identified all the identifying variables and we've transformed them so they don't have identifying information, we always need to evaluate the context as well, right? So data privacy is always tied to a specific context. For example, the data privacy for Elon Musk will be much more complex than for me, for example. So if there's a data set about me, it will be much more difficult to understand that this is my personal data than actually from Elon Musk, because we have much more public information about him, right? So the process of anonymization must be done always use case by use case, and taking into account specific outliers and specific contexts. And what can we do about that? So if we know that, for example, we are dealing with data from Elon Musk, which will be very easy for someone to say, hey, this is Elon Musk's data. Sometimes it's very important. I mean, it's always very important to not be able to identify a particular individual in a data. Let's say, for example, if we are dealing with medical data, um, if we have some information about that individual, it should be the risk that we can identify this individual in this medical history, it has to be very low, right? So if again we were dealing with data from Elon Musk, we have to apply some context controls, which means that we have to not only remove some identifiers in the data, but also make sure that nobody has access to this data, that we apply cybersecurity and infrastructure technical controls that will ensure that nobody can access this data. Maybe some attacker, that's how we call them, or more known as hackers, for example, that want to steal some of the data. And there are also contractual obligations that we can specify to ensure that there are no data breaches. And finally, once we've transformed our variables, we've evaluated the context, we have to measure the total risk of data breach, right? Um, the way that we measure the risk that we can identify a specific person in a data set is basically to measure the probability that I can know that this piece of information or this row here in this data set belongs to a particular person. Let's call it John. So let's say that I have a database from the medical records from a hospital. And I know that my friend John is going to that hospital because he has this particular disease, right? If I had access to this particular data set, and I know that John is 64 years old and he was born in March, I could actually think that this row belongs to John and actually derive some important and sensitive information about him, right? Thanks to techniques like I shared before, if we had age 69, for example, it would be much more difficult for us to match or to identify this row with John. So as you can imagine, and I will not get into that, there are a lot of probability theories and methods to measure the risk that I can identify or I can match one row to a specific person that I know. So finally, once we've measured the risk of re-identifying one person in the data set, plus we've identified the risk of the context and the specific use case, we will have a measure of risk. And basically, this risk needs to be lower than what we are accepting. So basically, we will define a threshold, and the risk always needs to be lower than that threshold. If the risk is not lower, we apply more transformations or we apply more contractual obligations, for example. But if it's a risk that we can accept, and again, we always talk about risk, so there's never zero, zero, zero risk that there can be a data breach, but the risk must be very, very, very low for an organization to use your data. So if this risk is very low, then we can proceed and use this anonymized data set. And again, as I said, um, organizations can only use your data if anonymized if you gave them consent, and they can only anonymize your data if you gave them consent to do so, because anonymization is also processing of the data. So in many situations, applying these anonymization techniques is can be a long process and also sometimes not provide not enough certainty of the data privacy of the data. So a lot of what we call privacy enhancing technologies have been born in the recent years or have gained a lot of momentum. Um, and they are actually quite interesting. To, they are very interesting technologies that ensure that data privacy is ensured. So, for example, we have encryption methods. Encryption methods really allow us to process encoded information in a way that only authorized parties can access it. So this ensures that only certain people can have access to that data. And again, if it was not clear, these are technologies that organizations use to ensure that your data can not be stolen or this data cannot be traced back to you. Okay, so if we have our data encrypted, it is much more difficult that anybody could actually access your data. We also have differential privacy, which is a technique that adds noise to the data to preserve privacy, but it allows meaningful analysis. We also have homomorphic encryption that basically allows computations to be performed on encrypted data without having to decrypt it. So this is even more safe than encryption in itself, right? Because we never decrypt the data. So we only work with data that is encrypted. Um, that's actually very interesting because it as you can imagine, it basically it gives a lot of certainty over the 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 security of the data. And finally, as I shared before, we also have anonymization techniques. They are also privacy technologies. But there are also some technologies that are powered by AI and are gaining more traction in the latest years because of advances in AI solutions. And synthetic data is one that I really love because I've been working on synthetic data for the past 3 years. And basically, synthetic data is a technology or a technique that allows us to generate an anonymized data set with similar statistical properties as the original one. So basically, if you look at these people don't really exist in this world, right? But they do have the characteristics of a real person. So I can actually work with this data without. It doesn't matter that this person doesn't exist, right? What I want is to have realistic data that I can use to start doing some statistical analysis, to start testing my solutions to building data platforms, etc. And I'm sure you've all played with all the novel generative AI tools that allow us to generate these really realistic pictures, right? So it's the same idea, but in organizations, instead of generating these images, we would generate tables, tables that are so realistic or as realistic as these images. So, for example, from a real data set, we would train an algorithm um, to basically generate um, synthetic data that it does not belong to any real person, but it actually has some real statistical distributions. So basically, again, it allows us to start doing um, advanced research and scientific developments to advance the development of platforms and solutions. In my case, to advance medical research, um, but without using real data from real people. So basically, preserving privacy as a whole, right? And of course, we could actually generate images instead of tables. In the case, for example, of medical images, we could actually generate those really realistic images of a breast or a lung to also advance research. And finally, another technology that I would like to share today is federated learning. And federated learning basically enables model training. So the training of machine learning models across distributed environments without sharing the data. So this ensures that your data stays private, but still contributes to machine learning model developments. And so the way it works is basically model updates are computed locally in different individual devices. So that could be, for example, your phone, and it does that by using local data, and then only aggregated model updates will be shared with this central server or this global AI model. And so basically, this approach allows organizations to train machine learning models and therefore to advance research without having to centralize all the data on a single server. So therefore, definitely preserves privacy while still benefiting the work and advances in research. As we explore data privacy further, we find a significant asset that is responsible AI. I think it is imperative that AI systems make decisions ethically and that they are trustworthy, that we can use them and be have trust on this system, right? And that they make sure that they respect and have into consideration human values and human privacy and human rights. And so the field of responsible AI is somewhat a new field. That more than new, it's actually getting a lot of momentum right now due to all the advances and also hype in AI and LLMs, and actually the fact that LLMs are now used by um, everyone, right? Also non-technical people because of the UIs and so on that have given everyone access to those models. These models that are now open to the public can pose significant risks to the general population. And the field of responsible AI ensures that those models, um, again, are built for the population and with human values in mind. And so responsible AI has four different or five different, there are a lot of definitions, but to me, I would say there are four main important pillars in responsible AI, which is one, fairness. So AI models should not introduce bias in the decision making process, and basically they should serve everyone in the same way. So they should serve all users from all different populations in the same way. AI systems should be systems that take um, uh, privacy by design, really, so they don't offer additional risks for individual privacy. AI models should be transparent and explainable, meaning that users should understand what how they are built, what do they do, how do they take decisions, and users should also know what are their limitations, what things this AI system can or cannot do. And finally, accountability, which is very important. So people that build AI models now are accountable for their outcomes, and this puts some responsibility into the shoulders of people that build those AI models to ensure that again they are ethical and can be trusted. And I think all these factors are key for us to gain trust in AI and the world of data. And because we are actually starting to incorporate AI in our daily lives. And in fact, with regulations like the European AI Act, which is very much focused on these topics that I shared now and on the risk of AI systems, thanks to these regulations, actually now organizations must adopt these responsible AI principles and practices, and they have accountability for that. So this ensures that not only data privacy is ensured in the process of building AI models, but also fairness and also ethics and also trust in AI models. And I strongly believe that these practices and these regulations are crucial for building public confidence in the world of data and algorithms. And we've reached the end of our journey into the world of data privacy. I hope I could share something about the basics of data privacy and a bit of responsible AI as well. I hope this was easy to digest. That was at least my first idea. And but if not, now we have, I'm sure, at least 20 or 30 minutes for questions. So thank you for listening.
Yes. Thank you very much, Marta. It's been really eye-opening for sure. And indeed, just to reinstate what Marta was saying, please ask any and all questions in the chat, and then we will make sure that we try to cover them to the best of our ability. And we already do have a few questions that have popped up. So maybe Marta, if you'd care to enlighten us, first of all, in the risk section, all right, um, of the data privacy talk, there are a few questions regarding how to measure the risks. What is the unit used for this task, if there is a unit possible, and also who is responsible for measuring those risks. And so maybe you can share a few insights or a few ideas or areas where we can start thinking about these topics regarding risk calculations and risk unit taking AS.
Yes, sure. So, in terms of measuring risk, there are many ways to measure the risk, many methods. And you can, yeah, basically, I mean, if you Google it, you'll see there are a lot of theories around that. Um, but basically, they focus mainly on these two factors that I shared. So, one is what is the probability that I can re-identify an individual in this data set? And there are three main things that we need to take into account, right? So one, what is the risk that I can identify or that I can disclose the identity of an individual? Then what is the risk that I can gain some valuable information about that individual? And what is the risk that I can um, derive more information about this individual by linking databases? And these are three of the main criteria explained in the GDPR. And what that means is that, for example, if I get access somehow to a medical records database, and I see information about different people. Um, first, it has to be very, very, very difficult for me to find my friend in that list, right? And the probability that I do that has to be very low. How do we measure that probability? Again, there are many ways, but one of the ways that we can follow is, can I measure the probability? So I take the general population. So this population can mean a lot of things. So population can be the whole population in the world. It could be the population of patients that attend this hospital, for example. Um, and then I can count how many matches I can do. So, for example, how many women of age 64 that were born in March there are in this medical records database. And as you can imagine, I can count how many matches do I have, and then I have a number. And from this number, I can derive this risk or this probability, right? Um, and then the second thing is very important is that, okay, I've identified my friend in this database. Okay, I already knew that this friend is going to that hospital. So does it give me any valuable information? Probably not. But what if in this data set I can see that my friend has this disease that I didn't know about, right? That is very important. And that's what we call a data breach. So there are mathematical theories about information gain, and I encourage you to search for information gain theories that basically allow you to measure this risk of how much information I can gain from this data breach. And this basically sums to the overall risk of re-identifying a person. I hope that answers your question. And who measures risk? um, who measures risk? So basically, I mean, in most organizations there is a data privacy officer, and with a team that's responsible to basically ensure that the risk of re-identification and in general data breach is very low. um, there's always also the figure of data owner, so the data owner which is responsible for all those processes, and for the the data in itself, for all the processes around that data that this person owns. But the person that would measure this risk is the team, in the data privacy team. I hope I was clear. I was thinking a bit out loud.
Mhm. I think so. And don't hesitate to ask follow-up questions. We actually have another follow-up questions, this time not on the topic of risk, and maybe a bit less relative to your functions, but how do we know that companies collecting our data are respecting our privacy and applying the GDPR? What are some telltale signs and or guides that you might be able to walk us through to see if companies are indeed respecting GDPR?
Well, we know that companies are respecting GDPR because, I mean, should be respecting GDPR because the fines are very high. However, of course, we've heard in the news many times where there were data privacy breaches and companies had to pay high amounts and high fines for those data breaches. So by default, organizations will follow those principles. But for those companies that don't, basically, yeah, we always have access, as I shared before. We have access, and we have the right to request access to the data that has been collected about ourselves. Actually, honestly, I've never done that, and I don't know the right processes to do that. But for sure, we can do that, which is very important, and we can ask how is our data used. So basically, for example, if you go to a hospital or a clinic and they collect your data, you can always ask what data was collected from you, from your history, for example.
Indeed. And then just the last comment by Olivier, that means that you have an accurate database on personal data to measure. I think that's more relevant to something we were saying earlier. Um, I think we've currently run out of questions. On my end, I do have one little quick follow up on everything that was said. We talked a lot about the GDPR. Maybe if I can have in just a few minutes your thoughts on the AI Act, which I think is also maybe not as relative to data privacy per se, but very important for a very and a similar amount of reasons that we should have both the GDPR and the AI Act. So maybe you can walk us through how you are already implementing, how I think, well, especially in the healthcare, probably more, and we're already kind of tracking these systems that they have. But happy to have your thought here.
Yes. So you raised a very important point, that is that the two regulations are very important together, and being responsible with AI and with data also includes data privacy, right? So that's, I think, very important. The EU AI Act was actually it's been a long process, right? It was accepted not long ago, a few weeks ago. So it's not until now that companies really have to make an effort to comply with the European AI Act, which is great. I think finally we are seeing organizations take accountability about the ethics and responsibility of building AI systems. I think we still have a long way to go, in the sense that all regulations are still quite vague. And one of the main challenges that I see about these regulations is that it is very difficult to move from theory to practice. So, I shared with you um, that we have to build AI systems in a way that take human values into consideration, that they are built for humans and to solve their problems, right? That they are transparent, that they are fair to all the populations. Um, okay, how can I do that, right? How can I measure the fairness of my AI model? So there are many tools to assess, the bias in your modeled results, for example. Um, how what does it mean that my model is built for an ethical purpose? I mean, what is an ethical purpose, right? And is my purpose for my organization seen as ethical for the general population or not? It's very difficult, right? And I believe, as at least I am a data scientist, so as a technical person that also speaks a lot with the legal teams. Um, so I can also share their point of view. The law is still very big, and I hope to see more updates on this. But I think we are in the right path, and that finally we'll start seeing, more transparency in the way that AI models are built.
Yeah, thank you so much. I don't see any more questions, so I think we're uh, very close to calling a wrap. Marta, thank you so much for your insights and for breaking down everything that we've talked about today. It's been a real pleasure to have you on this webinar series. For everyone watching, stay tuned because we will have other webinars coming in the weeks to come. So thank you to everyone. I wish you all a fantastic day, and I hope to see you all very soon. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you.